May 27, 1942. In a quiet office at Pearl Harbor, the war in the Pacific quietly shifted on its axis. Admiral Chester Nimitz sat behind his desk, staring at a folder so precise, so impossible, it almost seemed like magic. Inside were details of Japan's next attack, not guesses, not hunches, but exact bearings, times, and positions. How could America possibly know what Japan was planning before Japan itself even moved? This wasn't luck. It was the climax of a hidden war fought not on the seas, but in the shadows, by mathematicians, linguists, and cryptologists who worked in a cramped, windowless basement beneath Pearl Harbor. Armed not with guns, but with pencils, coffee, and brilliance, they cracked the uncrackable Japanese code and handed Nimitz the power to read every secret the enemy whispered. That morning, Nimitz realized something extraordinary. The future of the Pacific War could now be read in numbers. If you love stories that reveal the unseen battles behind history's biggest moments, hit like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more curious minds like you. And hey, if you think intelligence work sounds dry, just wait until you hear how a handful of exhausted codebreakers in a basement changed the course of World War II. It was a warm Hawaiian morning, May 27, 1942. Inside the Pacific Fleet headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz sat at his desk, the weight of an entire ocean resting on his shoulders. The scars of December 7th were still visible outside his window. Ships half sunken, the smell of oil still faint in the air. But this morning felt different. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, his intelligence officer, stood before him holding a thin brown folder. Inside were details that seemed too precise to be possible, the exact bearing of a Japanese fleet, the distance from Midway where they'd appear, even the hour they would attack. Layton spoke quietly, almost as if he feared the words themselves. "They're coming, sir, from the northwest, bearing 325. They'll strike at 0700 on June 4th. For a long moment, Nimitz didn't answer. He simply stared at the folder, a few pages that claimed to see into the enemy's mind. Nimitz finally leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "You're telling me," he asked, "that we know exactly where Yamamoto will be when he'll arrive and what he plans to do?" Layton nodded. His voice was steady. "That's correct, Admiral. We can read every order, every signal, every position report. We can read their secrets." Silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the ticking of the wall clock. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Nimitz allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. He realized what this meant. America now possessed something far more powerful than any weapon in its arsenal: foresight. The ability to see the future movements of an enemy who had never been defeated. It wasn't luck or divine intervention that had brought this folder to his desk. It was the work of a hidden army, men no one knew, fighting a war no one could see. Far below the sunlight and palm trees of Hawaii, in the basement of a nondescript concrete building near the submarine base, that hidden war had been raging for months. The room was called Station HYPO. 60 feet long, windowless, its air thick with cigarette smoke and the endless rattle of IBM machines sorting endless streams of 5-digit numbers. The men down there weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and even former Navy band members, men who could recognize patterns like others recognized melodies. Their commander, Joseph Rochefort, was an eccentric genius who preferred slippers to shoes and worked 3 days straight without rest. He wore a smoking jacket in the chilled air and drank coffee by the gallon. His team lived in that basement, sleeping on cots, decoding fragments of intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Each message was a puzzle of numbers that might, if pieced together, save thousands of lives. To the rest of the Navy, they were ghosts, unseen, uncelebrated, and often disbelieved. That morning, as Nimitz held the intelligence brief in his hands, he knew the tide of the Pacific War was about to shift, not because of superior firepower or sheer luck, but because of information. The men in that basement had cracked the code Japan believed unbreakable, a system known as JN-25. In doing so, they had given Nimitz the rarest gift in war, certainty. Yet he also understood the risk. Acting on intelligence that precise would take courage, and faith that those unseen cryptologists were right. If they were wrong, the U.S. Navy could be destroyed in a single stroke. But Nimitz had learned to trust intuition, and he saw in Layton's eyes the quiet confidence of a man who had seen truth written in numbers. As he rose from his chair, he simply said, "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the Pacific shimmered in the morning light, calm, vast, unaware that in just days its waters would bear witness to one of the greatest naval battles in history. Long before bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, a quieter kind of war had already begun. It didn't involve fleets or fighter planes, only paper, pencils, and minds sharp enough to see patterns in chaos. Back in the 1920s, when most of the Navy still thought of intelligence work as an afterthought, one young officer named Lawrence Safford saw the future coming. He believed that wars of the modern age wouldn't be won by the biggest guns, but by whoever controlled information. While others trained for battle at sea, Safford began assembling a small group of analysts in Washington. A few officers huddled over coded telegrams, trying to make sense of strange sequences of numbers and letters intercepted from across the Pacific. It was tedious, often thankless work. But Safford knew something few others did. Japan was rising fast, and one day, their ambitions would collide with America's. By 1924, Safford had quietly created the Navy's first organized code-breaking unit. It had no glamour, no budget, and almost no recognition. But it was the seed of what would later become a weapon as decisive as the atomic bomb. Safford began recruiting the strangest mix of men imaginable: linguists who had lived in Japan, mathematicians who could spot patterns others missed, and radio operators who could pluck whispers from the airwaves thousands of miles away. By the 1930s, his effort had expanded to a network of listening posts spread across the Pacific, in Hawaii, the Philippines, and Washington, D.C. These stations didn't just collect radio signals, they collected the heartbeat of an empire. Piece by piece, they were mapping the invisible web of Japanese naval communications. It was a kind of archaeology, uncovering a civilization's intentions, one intercepted message at a time. Among Safford's early recruits was a man who would later become legendary, Joseph Rochefort. He wasn't the type of officer you'd expect to change the course of a world war. He had a mischievous streak, a love for puzzles, and a mind that never seemed to stop working. He joined the Navy at 17 by lying about his age, and rather than being sent to sea, he was assigned to cryptography. He thrived there, decoding ciphers, inventing new systems, constantly pushing the limits of what could be understood. In 1929, the Navy sent him to Tokyo to master the Japanese language. For 3 years, he immersed himself not just in the words, but in the culture, the psychology, and the rhythm of how Japan's military thought. He saw how precise, structured, and ritualistic it was, and how that very structure could one day become its weakness. During his time in Tokyo, Rochefort met another young officer, Edwin Layton, whose fascination with Japanese strategy mirrored his own. The two would later become the perfect team, the codebreaker and the strategist, each trusting the other completely when the war finally came. By the late 1930s, as tension grew across the Pacific, Safford's small experiment had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence network. The Japanese Navy introduced its most complex code in 1939, JN-25, a monstrous system of 5-digit groups designed to be unbreakable. Every message was encrypted twice. First through a massive codebook of over 33,000 entries, then again with randomly changing additive numbers. To the Japanese, it was a fortress of secrecy. To Safford's team, it was a challenge. And deep in those code rooms, men like Rochefort began the long, grueling process of dismantling that fortress brick by brick. They didn't yet know it, but the patience, obsession, and brilliance they showed in those early years would one day hand Admiral Nimitz the power to outthink an entire empire and turn the tide of the Pacific War before the first shot of Midway was ever fired. Beneath the tropical calm of Pearl Harbor, far from the palm trees and parades, there was a room no one talked about. It sat under the 14th Naval District headquarters, a long, windowless basement humming with the constant clatter of machines. Fluorescent lights flickered on concrete walls, casting pale shadows over rows of desks stacked with intercepts, coffee mugs, and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. This was Station HYPO, the nerve center of America's code-breaking effort in the Pacific. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even comfortable. But inside those walls, the war's most decisive battle had already begun. Here, a handful of exhausted, eccentric men fought an invisible enemy made of numbers. And in time, they would become the only reason Admiral Nimitz could see beyond the fog of war. The man in charge was Joseph Rochefort, part genius, part maverick, and completely out of step with Navy bureaucracy. He was the kind of leader who ignored rank when talent mattered more. He wore slippers to work because the air conditioning was too cold, and a red silk smoking jacket because uniforms, he said, made it harder to think. His team was just as unconventional. Mathematicians, radio men, linguists, even former Navy band musicians whose knack for rhythm made them oddly perfect at spotting recurring number patterns. They worked 12, sometimes 20 hours straight, sleeping on cots between decoding sessions. Rochefort rarely left the basement. He'd disappear into clouds of cigarette smoke, muttering sequences of digits under his breath as he tried to see through the encryption wall Japan believed to be unbreakable. He didn't care for credit or medals, only results. "We're not heroes," he once said quietly to a colleague. "We're librarians trying to read a book that doesn't want to be read." The work itself was brutal. Each intercepted message came as a stream of 5-digit groups, endless rows of meaningless numbers. To decode even a fraction, the team had to strip away layers of additives, cross-reference patterns, and guess at meanings based on context. They'd fill card files by hand, thousands of them, noting every repeat, every anomaly. The IBM tabulating machines, loud and temperamental, became their mechanical allies. These hulking devices sorted punch cards faster than any human could, revealing patterns buried deep within the chaos. But machines could only go so far. The real breakthroughs came from intuition, that strange, almost artistic spark when a cryptanalyst suddenly felt a pattern rather than simply calculated it. To most of the Navy, this all seemed like madness. To Rochefort's team, it was life itself. Each code group they cracked was a small victory, a glimpse into the mind of an enemy planning its next strike. By early 1942, the basement had become a battlefield of its own, filled with tension, fatigue, and an unspoken sense of purpose. Pearl Harbor had been a wound that these men carried personally. They blamed themselves, though they'd had no real chance of preventing it. Now, decoding Japan's secrets became their redemption. Rochefort's men began to make real progress against JN-25B, the latest iteration of Japan's naval code. They could read fragments now, enough to sense movement, to feel the pulse of the Imperial Navy's ambitions. Each breakthrough came at a cost. Bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, and minds haunted by numbers even in sleep. Yet no one complained. They understood what few others did, that wars are not only won on battlefields. Sometimes they are won in rooms like this by men the world would never see, who fight not with weapons, but with understanding. Imagine staring at page after page of numbers. 5 digits, 5 digits, 5 digits, thousands of them, rolling in every day from across the Pacific. To most, it would look like meaningless noise. But to the men of Station HYPO, those numbers were alive. Hidden somewhere inside them were the plans of the Imperial Japanese Navy, movements of ships, attack orders, supply routes, even Yamamoto's own directives. The Japanese believed their code, JN-25, was impregnable. It wasn't a simple substitution cipher, but a fortress built from 2 layers of encryption. A massive codebook assigning each word a 5-digit number, then an additive table that changed constantly, making every message look different even when it said the same thing. To crack it meant fighting through 33,000 possible combinations for every term. A mathematical labyrinth. Most analysts thought it couldn't be done. Rochefort's team didn't agree. They didn't believe in unbreakable. They believed in persistence. For months, they waged a mental war against JN-25B, the latest and most complex version. The work was relentless. Days blurred into nights under the flicker of fluorescent lights as analysts sifted through message after message, searching for familiar patterns. Someone would spot a number sequence that seemed to repeat. Another would find a correlation to a previous intercept. Slowly, painfully, fragments began to take shape. They discovered the numeric groupings that represented ships, then bases, then even common military phrases like commence operations or prepare to depart. Sometimes a single decoded word changed everything. A ship name that revealed a fleet movement, or a date that hinted at an upcoming operation. They were reconstructing a hidden language one scrap at a time, like archaeologists uncovering the ruins of a lost civilization. Among them was Joseph Finnegan, a quiet mathematician whose mind worked like clockwork gears. He spent weeks analyzing how the Japanese encrypted their date and time groups, the most heavily disguised parts of the messages. His discovery of a recurring mathematical pattern, something he called a garble check, allowed HYPO to begin reading timing data for the first time. That single insight would later give Admiral Nimitz the exact day and hour of the Japanese strike on Midway. Then there was Thomas Dyer, who tamed the IBM tabulators, using machines once meant for accounting to process intercepted traffic at speeds no human could match. Alva Laswell, the linguist, could translate not just Japanese words, but tone and intent, understanding how their officers thought, what they feared, how they planned. Together they formed a symphony of intellect, different instruments playing toward the same impossible goal, reading the enemy's mind before he acted. By the spring of 1942, their relentless effort had begun to crack open the code's armor. They could now read about 1 in every 5 words. Not much, but enough to sense something massive forming across the Pacific. Messages kept referencing an upcoming operation, an objective designated simply as AF. Troop movements, ship deployments, supply convoys, all tied to AF. But what was it? Some analysts in Washington thought it was the Aleutian Islands, others believed it was somewhere in the South Pacific. Rochefort's gut told him otherwise. Every clue, every fragment of decoded traffic, pointed to one lonely outpost in the Central Pacific, Midway. If he was right, Japan was planning the trap that could finish the U.S. Navy once and for all. If he was wrong, America's remaining carriers might be lured into disaster. Either way, the battle to break the code had just turned into a race against time, a race that would decide the fate of the Pacific War. By mid-May 1942, the tension inside Station HYPO was almost unbearable. The men were running on caffeine and instinct, surviving on a few hours of sleep each night. The intercepted messages kept repeating that mysterious code group, AF. Whatever AF was, Japan was preparing something enormous. Carriers, troop transports, fuel ships, the entire machinery of invasion seemed to be converging around it. But the codebreakers still couldn't prove what AF meant. Washington wasn't convinced it was Midway. Some thought it might be the Aleutians, or even a diversion somewhere south. To Admiral Nimitz, the answer mattered more than anything. If he guessed wrong, the Pacific Fleet could be destroyed in a single strike. If he guessed right, he could change the course of the war. And so, in a smoky basement filled with exhausted men and clattering IBM machines, an idea emerged. Simple, brilliant, and slightly insane. The plan came from Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, one of Rochefort's officers. "If they're listening to us," he said one night, "why don't we feed them something they can't resist?" His idea was to plant a piece of bait so specific that if the Japanese took it, they'd reveal what AF truly was. The team knew that Japanese intelligence monitored American radio traffic religiously. So they decided to send an uncoded message, one the Japanese could easily intercept, claiming that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down and the island was running dangerously low on fresh water. It would sound like a routine maintenance report, the kind of mundane chatter every base transmitted. But if Japan's coded messages later mentioned an island suffering a water shortage, the mystery would be solved. Nimitz approved the ruse immediately. On May 19, 1942, Midway sent the message. "We're short of fresh water. The distillation plant is out of order." Then all they could do was wait. For 2 days, the basement at Station HYPO was a pressure cooker. The analysts pored over every intercepted message from Tokyo, every naval communication between Japanese commands. Then, on May 22nd, the breakthrough came. A Japanese intelligence report was intercepted, encrypted in JN-25, and sent from Tokyo to the fleet. When the team stripped away the additives and read the core message, their exhaustion turned into electric silence. The report stated that AF is short of water. The room erupted. Cheers, laughter, even tears. Months of guessing, weeks of debate, all confirmed by a single intercepted line. AF was Midway. The trap was now set. Rochefort rushed the news to Leighton, who delivered it straight to Nimitz. For the first time in the war, the United States knew not just that an attack was coming, but exactly where it would strike. And now the race was on. Nimitz could finally plan his counterattack, but everything hinged on timing. HYPO's analysts worked around the clock, searching every message for the date and hour of Japan's move. Finnegan's method for decoding the date-time groups finally cracked it. The strike would come at dawn on June 4, 1942, from the northwest, around bearing 325 degrees. It was all there, in the enemy's own words. On May 27th, as the damaged carrier Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor for emergency repairs, Leighton stood once again before Admiral Nimitz and delivered what sounded almost impossible. They'll arrive on June 4th. Attack at 0700 hours, bearing 325. Nimitz didn't hesitate. He trusted his codebreakers. He trusted the ghosts in the basement. "Then we'll meet them," he said quietly. And in that moment, the fate of the Pacific turned, not by chance, but by the intelligence and audacity of men who had learned how to make the enemy speak. By the final days of May 1942, the Pacific was teetering on a knife's edge. The Japanese Navy, undefeated and supremely confident, was preparing to deliver what it believed would be the final blow against the United States: the seizure of Midway. Meanwhile, deep inside his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz was about to gamble everything. The intelligence was astonishingly detailed: the date, the time, the direction of approach. But as precise as it seemed, it was still the product of a hidden war fought with logic, intuition, and luck. Nimitz knew that if Rochefort's men were wrong, even slightly, the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be annihilated. America would lose its last 3 carriers, and Japan would own the Pacific. But Nimitz wasn't a man who flinched at risk. He trusted the intelligence, trusted Rochefort, trusted Leighton, trusted the quiet brilliance of men no one else even knew existed. While Washington hesitated, Nimitz acted. He ordered his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, to take position northeast of Midway, directly along the path of the approaching Japanese fleet. The plan was audacious. Instead of waiting to be attacked, Nimitz would ambush the ambushers. But there was a problem. Yorktown had been mauled weeks earlier in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Engineers at Pearl Harbor estimated she'd need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of wartime determination ever witnessed. More than 2,400 shipyard workers swarmed the wounded carrier, welding, cutting, and rebuilding around the clock. Entire blocks of Honolulu went dark as power was diverted to her repair crews. On the morning of May 30th, just 72 hours after limping into port, Yorktown steamed out again, patched, scarred, and still carrying civilian workers who hadn't even finished the job. She was heading straight into battle. Meanwhile, in the dim basement of Station HYPO, Rochefort's team worked through exhaustion, checking and rechecking every decrypted line. Were they certain? Was the timing still right? Could Yamamoto change course? Each intercepted message brought another wave of anxiety. They knew how fragile their lead was. One codebook change, one missed intercept, and they'd be blind again. But they also knew what was coming. Japan's plan, now laid bare, was a masterpiece of overconfidence. Yamamoto had divided his fleet into 4 separate task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean. A fatal mistake born of arrogance. He believed American morale was broken. He believed Nimitz would never dare strike first. He believed his codes were unbreakable. Rochefort's men smiled grimly whenever they read those words in intercepted messages. They knew better. As the U.S. carriers slipped into position north of Midway, the ocean seemed deceptively calm. No one aboard Enterprise or Hornet knew just how much they owed to the unseen war beneath their feet. Only a few officers were aware that the entire operation, every ship movement, every battle plan, rested on the work of a handful of men in a concrete basement. The crews prepared their aircraft, sailors scrubbed decks, pilots studied charts, unaware that the enemy they were about to face was already walking into a trap. When Admiral Nimitz gave the final order, it was with quiet certainty. Deploy the fleet. Prepare for contact. No bravado, no speeches. Just the calm voice of a commander who, for the first time in the Pacific War, knew more than the enemy did. The pieces were in place. The stage was set, and in just a few days, the Pacific would erupt, and the fate of nations would hinge on who truly understood the power of information. June 4th, 1942. The Pacific dawn was calm, a pale horizon stretching endlessly across the sea. On the small speck of land called Midway Atoll, radar operators scanned the skies and picked up a faint echo, aircraft, dozens of them, approaching fast from the northwest, exactly as Station HYPO had predicted. At those 700 hours, almost to the minute, Japanese planes roared out of the clouds, bombing runways, fuel depots, and hangars. The island erupted in smoke and fire. But Admiral Yamamoto's fleet didn't know that they weren't the hunters this time. They were the hunted. 100 miles northeast, hidden beyond the curve of the Earth, 3 American carriers waited silently. On the Enterprise's flight deck, pilots stood beside their dauntless dive bombers, engines idling, listening to the crackle of radio reports from Midway. The trap had sprung, and the most powerful navy on Earth was walking straight into it. The first few hours were chaos. American land-based bombers from Midway launched desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers, striking bravely but without success. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire. Many never returned. Yet their sacrifice did something crucial. It forced the Japanese carriers to keep their decks busy, rearming and refueling aircraft just as Nimitz's strike force moved into position. At 10:20 a.m., after hours of searching the empty ocean, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers, launched from Enterprise and Yorktown, suddenly broke through the clouds above the Japanese fleet. What they saw below looked like a gift from the gods. 3 enemy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, packed with planes, fuel hoses snaking across their decks, bombs and torpedoes stacked in neat lines. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then the sky fell. In less than 5 minutes, everything changed. The American dive bombers plunged out of the sun in near-perfect formation, releasing their payloads from 15,000 feet. Explosions ripped across the decks of all 3 carriers almost simultaneously. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. The ocean itself seemed to tremble. Japanese sailors dove overboard as infernos engulfed their ships. Within an hour, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning wrecks, doomed to sink. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that managed to cripple the Yorktown. But by late afternoon, American aircraft found and destroyed Hiryu as well. By sunset, the balance of power in the Pacific had been rewritten. 4 of Japan's most elite carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were gone. When Admiral Nimitz received word of the victory, he looked at Leighton and smiled faintly. "Your timing was off," he said, "by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. It was half a joke, half a miracle. What had happened at Midway was more than a naval victory. It was proof that information could win wars. Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. America had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and 307 men, but had gained something far greater: momentum. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had stopped running. The tide had turned, and it all began with a handful of sleepless men in a basement who refused to believe any code was truly unbreakable. Midway was not just a battle, it was a revelation. The moment intelligence outthought strength, and the course of history changed forever. By the spring of 1943, the tide of the Pacific War had fully turned, and much of that power came not from ships or soldiers, but from information. Station HYPO was still deep in its secret war, quietly reading Japan's most guarded communications. The Japanese never suspected a thing. They kept using the same code system, JN-25, believing it to be secure, unaware that the Americans were inside their networks, listening, analyzing, predicting. Every time the Japanese moved a convoy or planned an operation, Nimitz already knew. Submarines were waiting where enemy ships would pass. Bombers struck airfields before Japanese planes even arrived. It was as if the United States had learned to see the future. Then, in April 1943, one decrypted message appeared on the analysts' desks that stopped everyone cold. It wasn't about ships or bases. It was about a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. The intercepted message outlined Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour across the Solomon Islands. It included everything: his itinerary, his flight number, departure and arrival times, even the route his plane would take over the jungles of Bougainville. It was the kind of intelligence every commander dreams of, and every spy fears. When the decrypted message reached Admiral Nimitz's desk, he knew immediately what it meant. America had a chance to strike at the heart of the Japanese Navy, to eliminate the man who had humiliated them at Pearl Harbor. But there was a moral weight to it, too. Targeting an individual, especially one so senior, was unprecedented. Nimitz took the intelligence to Washington, where President Roosevelt gave a short, cold directive: get Yamamoto. The mission would be known as Operation Vengeance, and it would be planned in total secrecy. 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters were chosen for the task. They would fly a daring low-altitude interception from Guadalcanal, more than 400 miles over open ocean, with barely enough fuel to make it home. The pilots were told only that their target was an important enemy officer. They took off at dawn on April 18, 1943. 2 hours later, right on schedule, 2 Japanese bombers appeared over the jungle canopy, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The Americans pounced. In a matter of minutes, one of the bombers spiraled into the trees trailing smoke. The other crashed moments later. In the wreckage lay Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early victories, the man who had once promised to dictate peace terms from the White House. He had been killed exactly as planned, his flight shot down at the precise time and location the decrypted message had revealed. The Codebreakers had done what no battleship could. They had reached across the Pacific and struck Japan's heart. The world would not learn the full truth for decades. Officially, Yamamoto's death was reported as the result of a lucky patrol interception. Only a handful of people knew the real story, that it had been made possible by a piece of intelligence plucked from Japan's own encrypted network. The operation's success was both stunning and chilling. For the men at Station HYPO, it proved beyond question that information was now the deadliest weapon in war. But it also came with a haunting realization. When you can read the enemy's thoughts, you also bear the burden of deciding how to use that power. For Admiral Nimitz and his cryptologists, Yamamoto's death was a triumph of skill and secrecy, and a reminder that in the new world of warfare, the greatest victories were often those no one could ever acknowledge. The victory at Midway and the success of Operation Vengeance had made intelligence the quiet weapon that turned the tide of the Pacific. But for the men who had made it possible, recognition never came. At least, not then. In the months following Midway, Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO kept working tirelessly, continuing to break Japanese codes and deliver vital intelligence. Yet behind the scenes, politics began to poison the triumph. In Washington, certain officers, particularly the Redmond brothers in naval intelligence, resented Rochefort's independence. They disliked that he reported directly to Admiral Nimitz, bypassing the traditional chain of command. They saw his success not as a national victory, but as a challenge to their authority. So they began whispering. By October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was quietly removed from Station HYPO. His orders sent him to supervise the construction of floating dry docks in San Francisco, far from the war he'd helped to shape. For Rochefort, it was a devastating blow. He'd spent years living underground, surviving on coffee and cigarettes, fighting an invisible war no one else understood. Now, he was exiled to bureaucratic obscurity. The men he'd led, the brilliant cryptanalysts who had broken JN-25, watched their commander vanish from the heart of the operation. He never complained, never sought revenge, but those who knew him could see the quiet heartbreak behind his calm exterior. Admiral Nimitz was furious but powerless. When he recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal, the recognition he deserved for winning Midway, Washington refused. The excuse was insufficient documentation. The truth was pettier: jealousy. The Navy's greatest cryptologic triumph had become mired in politics, and the man responsible was erased from the official story. Rochefort wasn't the only one. Lawrence Safford, the man who had founded naval cryptology decades earlier, was also sidelined, stripped of his command at the height of the war. Even Edwin Layton, whose calm briefings had guided Nimitz through every battle, found himself largely forgotten after the war ended. For decades, the true story of Station HYPO remained locked away behind classification stamps and sealed archives. The men who had read Japan's secrets returned to quiet civilian lives, unable to speak of what they had done. They couldn't tell their families that they had changed the course of history. They couldn't explain the sleepless nights, the endless numbers, or the moment they realized they could see through the enemy's eyes. They carried those memories silently, proud, but unrecognized. It wasn't until the late 1970s that the story began to surface. Declassified documents finally revealed the scale of their achievement. Historians began piecing together how the Battle of Midway had truly been won, not just on the waves, but in the minds of a few men working in a basement. In 1986, more than 4 decades after his greatest triumph, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Joseph Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal. His family accepted it on his behalf in the White House, as senior officers and intelligence chiefs finally spoke his name with the honor it deserved. It was recognition that had come far too late, but it restored his place in history. The ghosts of Station HYPO had waited decades to be heard. At last, their silence was broken. In the quiet aftermath of victory, the noise of war fades. But the echoes of what was learned continue long after the last shot is fired. The men of Station HYPO never fired a weapon, never set foot on a battlefield, yet their fingerprints are all over history. Their story became the blueprint for a new kind of warfare, one where battles are fought not with guns, but with information. When the National Security Agency was created in 1952, it borrowed much of its philosophy from what Rochefort and Safford had built in those early days. The idea that language, mathematics, and technology could combine to pierce any secret. The intelligence practices born in that windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, cross-station collaboration, data analysis, signal interception, became the foundation of modern espionage. What began with pencils, paper, and punch cards grew into satellites, supercomputers, and cyber defense. The war they fought didn't just change history, it changed how the world would wage war forever. But the lesson of Station HYPO runs deeper than codes and machines. It's about people, flawed, brilliant, stubborn people who refuse to give up. Rochefort's eccentric leadership turned chaos into creativity. Finnegan's mathematical insight cracked the uncrackable. Laswell's linguistic precision gave life to the enemy's words. Layton's composure turned intelligence into strategy. And Nimitz, calm, deliberate, unshakable, had the courage to trust them when others didn't. Every victory that followed Midway carried their invisible fingerprints. Every Japanese convoy sunk, every ambush avoided, every strategic decision made with perfect timing, all of it traced back to those minds in the basement who turned noise into knowledge. Even decades later, their influence lingers. The principle that information is power defines not just modern warfare, but modern life. Governments, corporations, even individuals now fight their own battles in the digital realm, with data as both shield and sword, and yet the human element remains unchanged. Behind every line of code, every algorithm, every satellite transmission, there is still a person. Someone who must interpret, decide, and take responsibility for what that information means. That's what the men of Station HYPO understood. That intelligence is never just about knowing the truth, but about having the courage to act on it. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Nimitz looked at a folder filled with impossible knowledge and realized he could read every Japanese secret. A week later, he used that knowledge to win the Battle of Midway, the moment the Pacific War began to turn. The ships are gone now, the code machines silent, but their story endures. It's written in every act of analysis, every decision made with insight instead of impulse, every leader who dares to trust the unseen. The war they fought in the shadows proved that intelligence, in all its quiet, invisible power, can change the course of the world. And it all began with a handful of men in a basement who saw meaning in the meaningless and gave their commander the one weapon no enemy could defend against: the truth.